So, hello everyone. We are back with the Blockchain Factory from Porto Business School, and I would like to present you Lucia Gallardo. It's a great pleasure to have her. She's founder and CEO of Emerge and co-founder of Eternals. And for its work across both the public and private sector, Emerge has been nominated for the Global SDG Awards and Newsweek's Blockchain Impact Awards. And not only that, Lucia is an MIT Innovator Under 35 and was previously nominated for the prestigious Cartier Science and Technology Pioneer Award. And presently, she advises or consults for organizations such as UNDP, Hard Rock International, and some others. She's a serial experimenter and entrepreneur, builds custom technology systems at the convergence of sustainable development, exponential technologies, and what it's called reimagined social economic incentives and behaviors. So I'm very happy and proud to have Lucia as one of our esteemed guest speakers. Thank you, Lucia, for having us and for having you here. And the stage is yours.
Thanks. I really appreciate it. And I'm super excited about the topics that we're going to cover today. Super excited about the work that you've been doing through the Open Executive Forum, specifically within the blockchain space. So very excited to dig in today. I've prepared a tiny presentation to sort of set some context into the way that both I and my company see the world and why we've taken on this thesis around some of the factors that we'll be talking about today: ecomimetry, sociology, finance, and how they inform technological innovation. So if it's okay with you, I will dive into the slides and then we can maybe hop into some questions.
That sounds great.
Perfect. Let me share my screen, and if you can just confirm that you can see it. Is it my desktop or is it my...
We were just seeing a blank screen, so I would say now we can see it. Great.
Perfect. Great. Awesome. Great. So I'll just dig right in with one of my favorite little pieces of research that I've sort of dug into over the past year. The Washington University of the United States did a study on Fortune 500 companies, and they've been sort of spotting a trend that they seem to be disappearing, and that they predict that about 40% of them will disappear within the next 10 years. And we find that particularly fascinating because Fortune 500, Fortune 100 companies have had a tendency to have very long legacies, and they're the companies that are most well known around the world. They tend to project a feeling of security, legacy, and a future viability that we sort of have learned to have faith in within our economic sector. So the fact that they're disappearing and that they're at risk, or that new companies are entering the Fortune 500 list, became very interesting to us. And we wanted to understand why they might be disappearing. And the factors that we landed on are really these very big shifts that are happening at both a consumer and market level, and at a grander social level, macroeconomic level, which is adding pressure to a lot of companies to be able to anticipate these shifts, to respond to them very, very quickly, and to have some kind of innovation process that allows them greater resilience and greater adaptability to the way that the world is shifting. And so with that, we started to do some research and look into what is changing specifically. And what we found was that investors, for example, feel that what they understand of economic markets is losing its relevance. People are responding to different kinds of economic incentives. There's really big shifts in demand and supply. There's greater globalization in the way that consumers and suppliers engage. You can, in theory, order, products and services from anywhere in the world. And so this changes the way that we view supply and demand within a national economy or within a particular competitive landscape. On top of that, you've got these really big issues that are cementing and creating big problems in supply chains and in consumer dynamics. You've got around 40 active violent conflicts around the world, and we've seen the way that mobilization in the Ukraine-Russia context informed a lot of the prices in electricity, or also in what was available to purchase in the way that certain commodities fluctuated. We have noticed that we are looking at an increasingly digital world, but we have over 1.1 billion people that currently lack the ability to enter this digital world to prove their identity, to be able to access services that require proof of identity, like banking services, or even public services that today are becoming increasingly electronic. And we're seeing greater economic inequity. So we know that, over the past few years, it's been getting worse. The pandemic worsened this, where 26 people last year owned the same amount of wealth and concentration that 3.8 billion people owned. That's a huge differentiator in terms of economic potential, economic power, the opportunity to create economic upward mobility for millions of people, billions of people around the world. And that creates a lot of frustration within consumer bases, and it creates a lot of exclusion within who can participate as a consumer in our different markets. We know that climate change is creating massive opportunities for people to lose a lot, to become vulnerable to natural disasters. We know that climate change is exacerbating, flooding and natural disasters, as we're seeing in Libya, as we're seeing in other parts of the world that are experiencing extreme heat or extreme rain. And we know that the future of work is changing. We know that AI and automation are displacing a lot of jobs. We know that young people feel like they're not prepared for the future of work. Like sometimes their education doesn't prepare them for working within an environment that has adopted AI, or that has increased automation, that the roles that they might be going to school for might become obsolete in the next few years. So these are all concerns that even young people in very developed, or what we would consider economically forward countries, are suffering, let alone those that are in countries that are technologically behind the adoption curve. And we're seeing greater trust issues between people and their governments, between people and companies. They want to see companies that act responsibly, that care about their workers. We're seeing a greater care for sustainable practices and environmentalism. We are seeing, a shapeshift of extreme politics around the world, and a right and a left that are constantly in disagreements in many countries around the world. And this is informing how capitalism, or how innovation, or how entrepreneurship takes shape in a country. Portugal's made some really wonderful, opportunities out of nomadic work. They've opened doors to a lot of people, but that's also had political, social, cultural, and economic ramifications in what Portuguese people are experiencing today. There's good things and bad things. And so you sort of see the landscape of entrepreneurship through how shifting political movements are informing decision making and how to build an innovation culture in a country. And you're also seeing greater freedom in people wanting to work remotely and wanting to travel more freely. You're seeing countries get rid of visas. You're starting to see more collaboration and opening up the world, and in trying to figure out how we can enable borderless travel, borderless work, borderless investment. And finally, you're looking at technology as a big conduit of this, of being able to reward value creation, of being able to provide people with very customized experiences from companies, and the products and services that we're trying to sell. And on the flip side of that, because technology presents such a big opportunity, you're seeing companies become very obsessed with putting out technology products, services, and that occasionally leads to potential solutionism, that we have so many products but none of them really fit the needs of the consuming entities, and none of them really fit the needs of this changing landscape. So it's really important to sort of factor in what is going on around the world. And then one of the biggest and most motivating trends for me to understand what's going on in the world is that we're about to see $70 trillion passed from baby boomers to Gen Z in the next 30 years. It's the biggest wealth transfer we've ever seen in history. And Gen Zs are very different from baby boomers as consumers. They want more sustainable products. They want impact to be part of a strategy in a business. They want socially responsible practices, and they're willing to pay more. They're willing to be more vocal and punishing when they see companies that are failing them, as we've seen many times on social media when companies are getting called out when they fail to live up to these standards. And we're seeing that consumers are increasingly listing sustainability and good ethical practices as a top five driver of value and reasons why they spend money in particular companies. And you're seeing great success stories in companies that are being forward thinking about how to think about impact. Patagonia, of course, being the greatest example of a really sustained loyal consumer base that ultimately led to a very creative ethical exit that enabled the company to grow in very new and refreshing ways that people are now modeling or trying to learn from. So you're really seeing a new class of consumers, and companies need to be prepared to understand how this shapeshifts their business and how this creates a new lens by which you need to study your own innovation strategy and prepare yourself for the adaptation that it's going to need in order to meet this new moment in time. And at the end of the day, I think the lesson here is that there's no real causation between deploying technology and having greater impact. We've seen, a desire to give everyone internet. And even in 2023, there are big portions of the population around the world that don't have consistent access to connectivity, despite the impact we thought and wanted it to have when, in the 1990s. And so unless we are very intentional about in designing and embedding impact into our core innovation strategy, at the end of the day, we fall short of this kind of grander mission to live in a better world that is technologically enabled, but much more inclusive and empowering than the one we've lived in before. And so with that, we've kind of come to this lecture, right, which is this idea that there's a theory of convergence of factors that need to drive innovation moving forward. And to us at Emerge, this sort of relates to finance, which of course we want to see more viable impact innovation. We want people to stop thinking about social impact as corporate social responsibility programs that live in a little department with a small budget. We want people to think about how we can incentivize consumers to choose our companies on the basis of impact, how we can reward impact action and drive financial value into mobilizing money, revenue into causes that are of collective well-being, like climate action. And we know, about sociology and the ways in which we need to account for cultural differences and the ways that we need to understand what consumers really want and the ways in which innovation sometimes is hindered by our obsession for mass adoption and scalability because it erases a lot of the nuance of lived experience of people around the world. And when you start building products for everyone, sometimes you end up with products for no one. And sociology plays a huge role in understanding how we design and ultimately deploy products so that they are effective and inclusive of a market that is now borderless. And finally, ecomimetry, which is probably a new concept for a lot of people here, but is really relating to the ways in which we take technological innovation and design it in ways that actually reflect nature. And there's great examples of this in the ways that solar energy is being designed, mimicking hexagonal patterns like the way you would find, in beehives. There's a lot of interest in replicating patterns around water flow and usage of how to cool data centers. There's a lot of interest in mimicking, for example, the ways that things grow and ungrow in response to certain types of actions and using data to enable and reflect that so that we can make better decisions across business practices and business verticals. So ultimately, we believe that ecomimetry and finance and sociology are really foundational to the way we need to reset our innovation agendas. And that's what we'd really love to dig into today. I think that's it for me. And I know, Rui, you've got a couple of lines of thought that you want to visit, and I'm super happy to start there.
Great. Well, this has been a kind of an avalanche of information, facts, and knowledge, which is great. And I'm sure the audience is, I would say, I don't want to say overwhelmed, but it has received a lot of info and a lot of knowledge. Mm-hmm. And probably we can split this into different areas. We can go into the area of technology and its impact. We can talk a little bit about ecomimetry, what are the key principles, because this is a construct that is somewhat new to some people. The theme of disappearing companies is quite interesting. I think that this should be addressed as well. as well
Sure.
as what you mentioned on the changing landscape. In other
Mhm.
words, not just the shifting of political movements, but also the way consumers deal with companies and deal with the, the, the different values of society and their own values. So, as we're mostly on the theme of blockchain, um, I think that one of the most interesting questions relates to how can business ensure that their technology their technological innovations
Mhm.
can have an impact, a positive impact on society.
Mhm. It's a great question, and I think most people today have that intention. I think leaders are really thinking about the societal impact of their existence, and you're starting to see a lot more companies launch very ambitious agendas around the environment and around social well-being. And that's really, really key. But I think when you're working in a department around innovation or when you are a strategic leader of a company, then I think the biggest assessment has to be, what are some of the possible unintended consequences of the work that we're doing? And also, I think, how do we take these principles of impact that we want to have and tie them much more closely to our core competency as a business? So, when you see a very large scale company like MasterCard that has, they have the One Tree Planted campaign where they're, actively incentivizing people to donate and to match donations around planting trees, and they're, actively planting many forests. That is a very great mission which they've taken very wholeheartedly. But what makes MasterCard special in this arena is that they are actually looking within their teams and departments around the world, and they're asking their loyalty program, their digital asset department, they're looking at their AI department, and they're saying, how does the work that you're doing contribute to our tree planting campaign, and vice versa? And so now you're starting to see experimentation across the MasterCard ecosystem, for example, that really relates to their environmental agenda. And I think that's the way that leaders need to be thinking about impact and innovation, is that it's no longer that you innovate and then you take some of that profit and you have impact, but rather, where do these two things converge? And how is it that our core competency can drive greater impact? And once you start analyzing your innovation agenda under that lens of how do these two things come together, I think companies have a real opportunity to set new precedents and become leaders in impact innovation and meet the type of consumer that is really asking for that, which, as we know, is two generations, millennials and Gen Z, care very deeply about this. So I think really, as a leader, thinking about that, thinking about how do these two things come together, and it's not that we innovate to create impact, but how are these two things happening at the same time, and how does our innovation inform our impact agenda, and how does our impact agenda drive our innovation agenda? And that convergence is really special, and there are great companies that are doing this very well. And I'm highlighting MasterCard because it's one that I have seen very, very closely, and that we're very excited to sort of see take huge steps in tying their global innovation agenda to their global environmental agenda.
Great. So you're seeing that there's a movement into a more impact-centric approach
Mhm.
rather than just ESG approach. Is that
Yeah.
what you're saying? Okay, great.
Yeah.
This leads to another question which relates to how can companies ensure longevity and relevance in the market? Because
Mhm.
not all companies have the ability to respond as swiftly as some very large corporations,
Mhm.
and some smaller companies have a very specific DNA, and those are a challenge to change. So how would
Mhm.
you address that?
Yeah, I mean, as a company that isn't considered large, I think this is a question that really speaks to me. I'm a big fan of form over function. I think, sometimes smaller companies have greater adaptability skills because they're smaller and because there's not that like level of bureaucracy where every decision needs to get approved by 20 different people before a final decision is made. So, sometimes I get really excited at the prospect of a smaller company that finds a niche issue and says, we're going to run with this and adapt a little to figure it out. I think there's lots of opportunity in that creativity. And so to me, I think when a company loses its like obsession with the form and the way that they've been doing things historically, and you start to really focus on the function, and you start reading, consumers, you start reading your intended stakeholders, your intended audiences, and you start understanding certain types of trends about what they care about and whether they care about that enough to put money toward it or to take money away from it. Understanding that and spending lots of time and lots of your design and research, resources, whether they're large resources or small resources, in understanding this idea of what do people care enough about that they're willing to take or add money into this as a principle, then losing your obsession with doing things in the way you've always done them, but trying to meet that moment. I think that flexibility is really what ensures the viability of business. But that means that you have to be constantly paying attention to what is changing in the world. You have to be, reading the news, and you have to be paying attention to your consumers, and you have to talk to them and meet them where they're at. And I think innovation teams that have a very big emphasis and a very slow design process, but a very fast build and development process, I think those are my favorite companies, because you know that they've taken the time to really understand what it is that they're trying to solve for, how they're going to change their features or their product or their services to really speak to the need of the consumer base that they want to attack. And then building becomes much faster, much easier. You can build things, at a much faster pace, and you can really become a company that is flexible enough to continuously evolve and meet the moment that it's in to ensure your long-term viability. And sometimes great companies struggle to do that because there's just too many decision makers that need to be involved in order for this to take place. And smaller companies can really use that as momentum to be first to market or second to market, and to really cement their place in what is going to be a future solution or a future need that is met.
Yeah, that part in part answered my next question, which would be how to adapt to rapid social, cultural, and economic shifts.
Mhm.
But the core of the question is, even before you need to adapt, you need to anticipate. How
Yes.
can companies better anticipate these rapid social, cultural, and economic shifts?
Yeah,
What
I
would
mean,
you?
I
Yeah,
think
go
as a
ahead.
leader, you have to be paying attention. You have to be paying attention to what is going on in the world, but more importantly is how are people responding to that in the markets that you care about. There's some really interesting research I did many, many years ago when I was working in AI. Somebody asked me about buyer behavior and buyer preferences across different markets. And so we started doing some research. And one of the things that really struck me was that, when we would look at Latin America, Latin American consumers were really, really price sensitive to the point that they were willing to drive 50 minutes out of their way to a store that guaranteed a better price for them. And when you were looking at the Middle East, the decision making between wanting to purchase something and actually purchasing it was, for most young millennials and Gen Z, was under 3 minutes. So they would literally research the first option that would come up. That's the one that they would buy. And when you are a company that is trying to put out a product or a service, you need to be able to understand the way that these like cultural shifts inform buyer decision making. So when you are trying to anticipate, those are the two levels that you need to be looking at. You need to be looking at what is going on in the world, economically, politically in a particular market. And then you need to see, how does that inform the consumer? How does that change the consumer? So as inflation became extraordinarily high in Latin America, you would see that reflected in how far people were willing to go to feel like they got the best price. So if you were a company that was trying to sell in Latin America, then being able to add in a feature that was like a price comparison and showing them that you are in fact offering the best price made you a better competitor, because then people could see that you were offering the best price and they could trust you and make that purchase in a shorter time frame. But if you are someone that is, building for the consumer in the Middle East, then you absolutely needed to invest in a huge SEO strategy so that you could be the first brand to pop up when you were, when someone was searching for a product that was in the line of what you're offering. And so looking at that lens and understanding as the Middle East was developing faster and certain countries were generating greater wealth for their citizens, that their buyer preferences hastened versus in Latin America, where inflation was changing, the buyer preferences became slower, then you needed two separate strategies to tackle that consumer base. And that's how a company adapts. You pay attention at a macro level, and then you see what that does to decision making and preferences in consumer choices.
Yeah, this is a great example, and to a certain extent, this leads it also to a concern, which is the fundamentals of the market dynamics are shifting.
Yeah.
What would you say are the what is differing? Where's the differentiation between the past and the present that is so great that is actually changing this landscape in such a fast way? Other than technology, everyone knows. Other than technology, and obviously the demographics and events, unfortunate events like more events or crisis and slash the war. What are the fundamentals that you can see a disrupted trend and even continuing trends?
Yeah, this is a fantastic question because I do think that we sometimes stay at this level of, market dynamics, but I think there's a sociological aspect that's very important here. One of the biggest things that has changed is what people care about and like how they learn about it. I think, right now we're seeing this really interesting way in which social media can drove droves of consumers to a particular product or service. And you've seen the influence that virality has in making a consumer choice. And I think that like what people care about, what they want to buy and who they want to buy it from has changed. I think at a values level, you're starting to see, a greater drive toward experiences as opposed to like flat material things. You're like Gen Zs and millennials, they're not prone to buying houses. They're not prone to setting themselves up to be like very local, and they're spending so much more money on travel and they're trying to see the world. That's a huge shift in how they see the world. And so this idea of what they care about, which is exploring and seeing the world and learning and opening themselves up to something, is very different than the type of consumer that is rooted or that finds themselves basing themselves. And that's a huge shift that I think isn't going anywhere. It's actually getting worse and worse. You're starting to see more people try to figure out how to travel, and you're starting to see so much content around experience and opening up of the world and remote work and remote culture. And I think that's a huge driver of consumer choice.
I understand that. Let me just, I don't want to challenge this because I think it's factual, but it's a bit paradoxical because you see Gen Z so worried about environment, carbon footprint, and traveling is probably one of the worst ways to impact the planet in terms of carbon. What I don't know if you ever asked a Gen Z about that, but I guess that it's a I don't call it a pulsion, but it is a desire that Gen Zs have to travel. So it's not something that you'll curve just out of a decree, but to a certain extent, there has to be a better way. And I'm not just proposing technologies as an alternative, but as a way of sharing experiences, not just to. So if all the world decided to visit the rest of the world, this would be completely unsustainable. So and this is something that that to a certain extent, given the increasing importance of sustainability, I think there's a lot of greenwashing, and I think that companies need to ensure that their sustainability claims are really genuine. How can companies do this without sounding like they're greenwashing?
Yeah, this is a fun question for me because I genuinely, as a very avid technologist and also as someone that cares very deeply about climatic impact, I see that there is a lot of course tension between increasing our digitization, needing more energy, needing more resources in order to sustain an increasingly digital world. And I, as someone that has been nomadic since 2016, also am quite the traveler. But I think this is where business really comes into play. And there are so many opportunities here for businesses to factor in to say, there are, yes, currently travel is quite unsustainable, but there are better ways to do that. And so you see, for example, some airline companies experimenting with jet fuel. And so Airbus, I think, has done a transatlantic flight using recycled cooking oil as its jet fuel. And you're starting to see some people build data centers that trap heat, recycle it, which we've done, by the way, through rendering one of our NFT projects. They trap heat and they recycle it, and then they use it to create an energy source for something else. So we actually are, for our project, we're donating the heat in turning it into a heat source for a public hospital, some social housing units. And that's a form of, yes, we're increasing digitization by producing this NFT collection, but then we're also converting an energy source in order to make sure that that heat doesn't escape into the atmosphere and create a greenhouse gas. So when it comes to companies greenwashing their impact, I think you can already automatically tell who's serious and who's not because of the type of ways that they're thinking about this issue. When they sort of tell you, we are having this initiative that is a community program or is a one-time benefit or is very much we're talking about climactic change within our company, you can tell that there's really no depth to the way that they're thinking about it. When you see a company that is looking at themselves as a means of production and they're questioning how they produce and how they source, and then that becomes a company that's very exciting. I'm not sure if you saw the Apple sustainability report for this year, but it's gone pretty viral because they turned it into a video and they brought in Octavia Spencer, who's a phenomenal actress, as Mother Nature. And one of the things that they sort of talked about, and one of the people that shared it on LinkedIn that led to the virality, was a sustainable sourcer. So Apple is hiring roles for people to actually look at their supply chain and figure out what are more sustainable ways to transform our supply chain. So when you are a company that is producing a product or a service, and you look at yourself as a means of production, and you're saying, how do we make that more sustainable? I think that's when you really see a company that isn't greenwashing, that isn't impact washing. And when you see companies that are saying, we're going to keep producing the same way, but we're going to, plant some trees on the side, then that's when it sort of becomes a little more suspect, more questionable. And companies that are able to do both, that are able to invest in projects, that are able to speak to projects, that are supporting projects while also transforming their means of production, those are the best ones.
Okay. I'm going to shift gears to something which is a bit controversial because everybody talks about greenwashing, everybody talks about ESG, everybody talks about sustainability and so on. But there's I don't want to call it a ageism pandemic, but I do believe that there's a lot of emphasis put on the younger generations and a lot of or reduced resources allocated or reduced attention to the wealth of and the knowledge of what I would call the silver economy or the silver generation. Right. This is definitely a challenge, especially in I don't see this much in the Nordics or in Northern Europe, but I see a lot in Southern Europe. In my experience, I've worked with multiple generations in the Nordics, but in the case of Southern Europe, there's a trend for ageism. What is your perspective of not just the problem, but also ways to solve this? It could be reverse mentoring, it could be ways to help older generations connect better through technology or connect better with technology. What's your take on this?
Yeah, this is great. I think I've seen exactly what you're talking about in many different situations. Even as companies are thinking about what technological initiatives to roll out, they worry about the impact it's going to have on their older consumers. And I think it's a very, very valid question. There's also a very interesting gap in which, coincidentally, the people that we would categorize in this silver generation are very much decision makers in many cases. They run governments, they run organizations, they run banks, they run a lot of very key organizations that are the ones that specifically do need to factor in, innovation and change and future viability. And so what's quite fascinating is, that despite the fact that there's a growing sense of ageism, the primary decision making and strategy is still guided by this generation. And so I think what needs to happen here is this is the gap that needs to converge, right? It's the idea that if you have a company that their leadership is primarily silver generation, then you need to be looking at how to include younger voices in that decision making room. And if you are a startup that is led by, a group of 20 somethings or a group of 30 somethings, and there is no silver generation in the room, then that needs to happen too, because they have a wealth of experience in understanding how to deploy technology, how to roll out a product or a service to a market, how to really understand the business aspect of innovation. And we go back to this issue of techno solutionism, where we have, a lot of young startups that think they're solving huge problems, and in actuality they're building solutions that often aren't even problems, or are problems that no one cares enough about to sustain. And so I think this idea of making sure that a leadership room and a strategy room has like various generations is becoming critically important because of this like huge gap that we have in technological adoption, understanding, openness. And so I think that would be the solution for me, is like look at the rooms where decisions are being made and what does that room look like. And if that room doesn't have ample representation of generational experience, then I think that's where you're going to be able to mostly run into these problems of not either producing something that most people won't be able to adopt, or of not being fast enough to be able to adapt to the pace of innovation.
Right. You mentioned techno-solutionism, and I see potential dangers of techno-solutionism, but I would like to focus more on how can these dangers be mitigated. Can you share some of this?
Yeah, I think for me, the biggest question when it comes to whether I'm falling into a trap of techno solutionism is the unintended consequences question. Um, Many years ago, I was asked to review a project, to do diligence on a project that was not working. It was a fintech product. They were rolling it out in a refugee camp, and it was intended to empower women to work and produce money. And so when you think about that, it's a great mission and it's solving a problem because women should be generating income. And in a refugee crisis, everyone needs to generate income so that you have the opportunity to have upward mobility. So, on principle and on paper, it's a great, great idea and solution. Now, they developed this app, they rolled it out in a test market. And initially, in the first couple of months, it had very high adoption. And later, about 6 months later, the users would completely drop off. They would stop using the product. And nobody could understand why at the moment. And so they brought a group of people together to try to assess why this was failing. And the consensus among the people that were auditing this was it was entirely a cultural product market fit issue. When refugee camps flood with people, the first wave of refugees is very often women, older generations, children, and people that are considered more vulnerable, because usually young men or even older men stay behind and try to, fight or protect or help escape. And so they come months later. And so what ended up happening was, when women were alone, when the youth was alone, they were using this app and they were generating income. But when the men came back, they're, culturally very important in the role of, economic work. Like they bring in a lot of the money. And when they were coming back, they felt really displaced, and it created tension, cultural tension in the home where they were coming back. And what were they coming back to? Their role had been supplanted. And that creates a lot of frustration and it creates family tension. And so the people that had been using the app were very willingly no longer using the app because they preferred keeping their family intact over, generating some kind of income. They wanted their family back. It wasn't their choice to be torn apart. They wanted it back. And so I think that that's really this idea that you can have the best intention, but what is the actual consequence that you're having in the ground? And in the blockchain world, I find this problem very, very frequently. When you see a lot of projects that say, we want to take this token to this community and we want to give them the means to have an economic system with this token. And then you say, okay, great, let's think about this. So here in this scenario, let's say that you, Ree, are a seller of paper and I require paper because I like to write and draw. And so I come to you and I use this token and I buy paper and you accept this token and I leave happy with my paper and you have this token. Now, there's some situations here that we need to factor in. If you are the maker of this paper and your suppliers of the things that you need to make paper accept this token, you're great. You accept this token, you're a happy person, and you can then use it to continue producing your paper. But if your suppliers are in a different town that doesn't use this token, then you have a problem, which is how am I going to then turn this into something that I can use to pay and source more materials and keep my business going? And so this is what we would call the money supply chain. And very often, a lot of token projects in the blockchain space have this unintended consequence where they don't trace far back enough in their money supply chain. And so you can roll this token out into a community and then it has no impact. And then it's a techno solutionism approach, because ultimately you're going to have a big problem where you can't meet the needs that you have and this token no longer works for you. And when we see that at scale around the world, of people thinking they're coming into a community that has, limited means, or they're poor and therefore this token will save them, that is a very huge problem when that money supply chain isn't traced, when incentives are not really understood. So I think the first way to combat this idea of techno solutionism is to understand the possible unintended consequences that your technology might have, and to really understand your entire supply chain and to understand what drives it, what helps it, what does not help it. And once you've sort of run that assessment as a risk management strategy, I think that really becomes the most effective way to prove that your solution has a place and it will lead to net positive impact.
Okay, great. I have a follow-up question on that.
Great.
We're now ad libbing because we've been exchanging so many questions and answers, and I'd like to stimulate the audience to ask whatever question they have. As you've seen, we've talked about many themes, and we're more than happy to ask your question or ask the audience question on anything that you'd like. And we've talked about many things, but if we follow up on this money supply chain, this entails something that can be quite concerning. Let's put it this way, which is basically central banks operate this supply chain. They are generators, regulators, consumers, producers, as well as flow controllers. So central banks tend to have a very high impact, if not, I want to qualify it, but a very high impact on the money supply and the money supply chain. How would you shift this power? Because this is typically a centralized approach, and this typically, by centralized, it actually permeates the outside of the core, let's put it this way, the edge of this supply chain. And to a certain extent, if the whole supply chain is not stimulated or incentivized to accept or deal with a token or deal with whatever decentralized solution, then there's little to do or not so much to do, but to not involve centralized entities like central banks. How would you approach this, and how would you make this a more, let's call it, inclusive approach?
You're putting me in hot water because I advise a lot of central banks, so this is very fun for me.
Yes.
I think, what's interesting here is there's a couple of ways to work through this. I mean, if you're at a strategic standpoint, if you're an executive at a company that has some kind of relationship with the central bank, I think a big piece of this is giving people the true value proposition of fractionalized money. I've had really fascinating conversations with banks around the world about this, where I think, there's a big misconception that tokens and cryptocurrencies are very much like a supplantation of money, or that they're intending to, completely remove control out of money and things like this. And what's particularly fascinating to me is that I've understood that the value proposition of a fractionalized money ecosystem is really that it's removing a lot of conflicts of interest from different types of tokens. So if you're a central bank and you have to make a lot of decisions around, inflation and interest rates and so on and so forth, one of the reasons you have to do that is because, there's different needs that we have to use money. So one of those needs, for example, is that you need it to settle payment between, two people. And you settle this payment, and in that case, it's very convenient for you to have a very stable coin, because if I'm selling you this paper, I want to make sure that I didn't overpay for this paper, and you want to make sure that I didn't underpay for this paper. So we want stability in transacting. But if I'm saving money, it's very convenient for that value to go up. So I want it to go up because I want my money to be worth more. I want my initial investment to grow. And if I'm borrowing money, it's really not convenient when inflation goes too high and I end up, being stuck in a loan that I might not be able to pay back. But we are expecting the same coin to do, which, let's say it's the American dollar, or let's say it's the euro or whatever, we're expecting the same type of money, the same type of coin to do all of these things at the same time, to be a means of settlement, to give us a potential future in investment, to be able to pay for things that we need, greater concentration of through a loan. These are all things that are happening at the same time. And so central banks have this huge problem, which is how do we balance the need for all of this? But a token ecosystem proposes something different. It says you can use one type of coin to settle payment, and you can use a different type of coin as an investment means. Buy some Bitcoin if you want to invest, but settle your payments in a stable coin, but maybe take a loan in a different thing. And so when you start to understand the value proposition of how do you use different types of money to achieve different types of means, I think that's where it becomes quite interesting for a central bank, because you can say, hey, this community can transact in this token and it can be compatible with other ways that you want to use money as a central bank, or you can issue your own type of money, and that becomes an option for consumers to have. And this idea of removing conflicts of interest around money, I have found as a narrative has worked very effectively with banks and central banks. So if you're at a strategic standpoint where you have the relationship where you can carry that conversation to a bank, I think that's an excellent place to start. If you're on the innovation, like startup side, you're trying to think what product to release, I think this is where the on-ramp, off-ramp part of money supply chains becomes so critically important. If you are a paper producer that needs to buy supplies, you need a way to change this money into something else. And being able to understand regulation and deliver this on-ramp, off-ramp in a way that still meets the regulation of the area that you're operating in, I think you can still be compatible with central bank policy. I think you can still be someone that can operate successfully in a particular market. And I think that, over time, we're sort of seeing that people are interested in the token economy. And if you can airdrop or use the value creation economy that a Web3 unlocks and generate this money and send it in the form of a token to begin with, then it opens up possibilities of what can be done through peer-to-peer trade. So I think there's many levels at which you can work this strategically. I'm not saying you have to ignore central banks if you're an innovator. I think you have to think about what type of product you're building. And if it's something that will interact with fiat, then it definitely has to go through some kind of on-ramp, off-ramp. And that's a very good place to focus your attention and energy to. If you are a pure DeFi, I don't care about central banks, I don't care about anything project, then you have to really think critically about how people can use your token. And this is where that big word in the blockchain space, utility, really becomes important. It's this idea that if you are going to be squarely in the DeFi space, that you've thought about utility to the 10th degree and enabled that utility to really drive value in the communities that you're trying to roll this out from. So it really just depends what type of innovator, what type of entrepreneur you are. But I think this can be, tackled on different levels. And if you're crazy enough like me, you're doing it in all levels at the same time.
Yeah, I'm being forced to ask another tough question, which is, do you think that CBDCs will be the killer of that conveyor belt?
Oh, man.
You were asking for it. You were asking for it.
Okay, let's see. Can we strategically block who was able to see this lecture? I think, I don't know that they're the killer app, to be honest. I don't think they're the killer app. I think the reason they're not is because there are some trust issues in money, in surveillance, in institutional trust and support and traceability and transparency that I think is very deeply rooted in a lot of countries today. You're seeing it in countries like the US, and you're seeing it as it has historically been true in countries like Africa and across Latin America. And so I think, I think people you would say El Salvador is an example of, where it maybe hasn't been going according to plan all that much. It's worked in some ways, it hasn't worked in other ways. So is it a killer app? I don't think it is. I don't think that's the killer app. But at the same time, I think it will have a very important precedent in an understanding of like why do we need money? Like, why is it specifically that we need money, and what are the different ways in which we need money, and what are the different ways in which monetary systems exist to respond to those needs? I think that's really the question that will be answered by CBDCs and their adoption rate. I don't think they're the killer app, to be frank. I know lots of people do, and they're going to hate me for giving that answer, but I think people will choose the mechanism that they feel really responds to some of the needs that they have. And it's the reason why crypto was adopted in the first place in many parts of the world. It was because their existing monetary system didn't respond to some of the needs that they had. They were worried about financial freedom, they were worried about trust, they were worried about their legacy when it comes to savings, and banks can kind of like do a little bit of whatever they want, and then they'll be bailed out, and then who pays for that? The consumer. So there's a lot of trust issues in the monetary system, and I think CBDCs have yet to really respond to some of those trust issues, other than provide a digital version of an instrument that is already suffering in trust. And so if you see a central bank that is really saying and doing that inward reflection of saying our monetary system failed a lot of consumers in recent history, and we want to design an instrument that has better blockers against that, then I'm very curious about that, and that could be something you roll out to great success. But if we're really just talking about digitizing existing central bank currency, then I think it's going to run into a lot of the same problems that the current fiat system has, and a lot of that relates to trust.
Yeah, I agree. I totally agree. So I think that we're going on to the final phase of the conversation, and I'd like you to share some thoughts that you had on that you mentioned during the presentation, especially on ecomimetry, because the intersection of these three fields, finance, sociology, ecomimetry, can and will influence technological innovation. How do you see this intersection influencing innovation overall?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a great thing to be able to design technology that fits very organically and very naturally into systems, ecosystems. And so when they mimic nature, that's what we're accustomed to and ingrained to see around us, right? So when we think about the way water flows and we use that to figure out how data can flow, or we draw inspiration from human processes. And, one of the things I've been researching a lot lately is intent-based networking, which is the idea that you design a system to self-audit and then self-fix. And you use, AI and smart contracts and things like that to do that. Who cares about the tooling? But the spirit of saying, like a cell, you sort of like regenerate and you self audit and figure out what needs fixing within a system. And you can design a system that has intent based networking within it. I think that's really powerful. So, ecomimetry is really this idea of saying there's a reason why nature works, and it's very complex, but it works. And so, there's certain processes that take place, photosynthesis, cellular rejuvenation, and things like that, that can really inspire the way we think about technology systems and digital systems. And when we are able to do that, they fit easier in the sociological context because human nature understands nature. Like we disrespect it all the time, don't get me wrong, but we know it, we understand it, we see the way that we grow and the way that we heal and the way that nature has its processes, and we're able to study that and understand that. And so I think the closer that we get to this moment of like real design that is inspired by nature, that is inspired by sociology and human behavior and human process, I think the easier it is to build something that people want to use, that they can adopt with greater ease, rather than having to go through a huge learning curve that then puts a lot of disparity in who can access and use and benefit from this technology. And once you sort of figured that out, how to design something that really fits naturally into an ecosystem, and you figure out what the incentive structure is for that, the financial aspect of it, what motivates someone to choose a service. Why are you on Binance over Coinbase? Why are you on Coinbase over Binance? Why is it that you chose this token? Why is it that you as a consumer made a decision to enter this space in the first place? What is it about NFTs that is interesting to you? Where are, what are the protections for intellectual property or for physical property that you need the technology system to address for you? What kinds of services are important to you to access at any given point in time, whether you're, with signal in an out, rural area, or whether you're in the middle of a city. So all of these questions and what drives people to really say, I need to use this. If you can really lock that down, if you can say, I understand the way things naturally work, and I understand what drives people to make the decision to use something, then your design process and your innovation process takes on a completely different form. And it makes your company particularly exciting because it's not even anticipating, it's just responding to something that will never change. Nature doesn't, it adapts to itself, but it doesn't change in its ability to thrive and outlive. And financial incentives are very ingrained in us. And so you're future proofing in a way that even lessens the need to anticipate. It's just something that will work because it's mirrored off of something that we know has worked for centuries. And that's, I think, the most exciting thing about rethinking innovation, in my opinion. It's looking at new inspiration and saying, what we've been doing, it works, but it doesn't really work because it's excluded too many people and it's frustrated a lot of people. But there are things that truly do work and inspire. And I think nature is a big one. And I think understanding sociology and financial incentives and true, desire to understand what compels a person to choose a product. I think those three things are really the element of what's going to create a class of innovation that is very future proof, that is viable, that is exciting, and that doesn't look like the frameworked, boxed methodologies that consulting companies love to sell us.
Okay, this is, we have a question from the audience, which is great. Someone, I'll name them. I hope I'm not incurring into some serious GDPR problem here, but I'll name the question anyway. Álvaro Martins, he congratulated the webinar. Thank you very much, Álvaro. But the question comes about Gen Z, and which is the effort to communicate, create services and products aimed at Generation Z worth it? Is it worth it? Is Gen Z purchasing power worth all this effort? And I'm not sure that this question was made from a Gen Z. So.
I mean, I think the answer is very much yes. And the only reason for that is who has money, right? Who has money? So where does purchasing power come from? It's coming from money. And who has money? And the answer is increasingly becoming millennials and Gen Z. Baby boomers have current wealth. Yes, they do. They're also dying, and they're also needing to transfer their wealth over. And you have a very active entrepreneurial Gen Z. You're starting to see a lot of people leverage these new financial instruments like, tokens, and to build projects that amass great amounts of wealth. You've seen really successful NFT projects, ICOs, you've seen really successful startups that are very fresh, that are generating huge amounts of financial value. And then on top of that, you've got $70 trillion that are about to pass into the hands of Gen Z. Is it worth it right now? Yes, because they're willing to pay more for certain types of services. Actually, we've seen certain product categories where Gen Zs are willing to pay 4 times the existing price in order to guarantee that something is done with better quality and better ethical and sustainable practices. So they're willing to pay more. And on top of that, they're about to come into more money than the world has ever seen. So is it worth it right now? I would say maybe not this precise moment, but if you're not thinking about tomorrow or the day after, then how viable is your business going to be? So they are worth the effort because they're tomorrow's consumer, and they have a very different personality when it comes to how they want to consume and what they want to consume.
Okay.
And how much,
how long do you want your business? On that. Let me challenge you on that. Let me go and defend Álvaro here. For a couple of reasons. First of all, especially in Southern Europe, I'm sure that you're aware that Gen Z is actually one that has the least purchasing power in relation to Western world, and we're seeing two trends. One is it's getting more and more difficult for Gen Z to actually increase their purchasing power. And the other point, which is quite interesting, is that the silver generation, and let's call it 50 plus, it will grow older and older, and will still have to spend that money. So, and it won't go to Gen Z as a pass through, but it may be just spent through consumption. That's one thing, and additionally, millennials have a different view. I would say that there's a generation gap between millennials and Gen Z, especially on purpose and impact. They're not so much alike. So how would you see this extended spending from the, let's call it the silver generation, that will not that will not allow that passage of wealth to Gen Zs?
So this is an interesting thing where macro comes back into play, right? Because you've got a lot of systems that are built on providing older generations with that funding. So when you think about a pension plan, for example, the way that it works is that the current generation puts in money, and then the retired generation pulls that money right now. And so it's an unsustainable system, but that's where a lot of this consumptive power from, like, I'm talking non-wealthy, like very much blue collar, lived a job, retired, and is now spending money. This money is coming from existing pension structures. Or you also have this idea of people that are running businesses, or that are, in positions of power, that do accumulate great wealth and then need to spend it, and maybe are increasing their lifespan because, modern, well, it depends on the country, but in modern medicine, supposedly you're supposed to increase a human lifespan, and then they've got more time to spend that money. But a couple of things happen here. And one is that as you age, the way you spend money gets a lot more stable. You don't make these, like, you're paying for services and you're limited in how much you can do. And so the money that you spend is very, very targeted. And that means that if you're in one of those, like, I own a retirement home, or I own like an activity center or a gymnasium, or I'm a doctor in that sort of area, then those are the things that sort of you will have consistency over experiencing, their consumption. But the reality is, they age out and they are passing their wealth. So we're looking at different timelines here. We're saying in the next 2 years, is it worth spending the effort on Gen Z? I don't know, because in some parts of the world, they have great accumulation of wealth. If you're looking at the Middle East and you're not saying Gen Z matters, then you're making a grave mistake, because Gen Z spends a ton of money in that region, and it does it with very little foresight into decision making of price. They are very much not price sensitive. Whereas in other economies, it might be different. And then you've got like Latin American culture, for example, where they take care, and actually this might be true also for countries like Portugal and Italy, where younger generations take care of older generations. And it's a family, and also in Southeast Asia, there's a lot of responsibility of caring for our family members. And so even if the money is owned by, let's say, the older generation, the decision making will no longer be. And the decision making is really where you want to focus your efforts. And I think this is something that is actually true on gender as well, where if you look at decision making in households in any country in the world, including countries that we perceive are more gender equal, like in the Nordic countries, women still make over 70% of household spending decisions. And so when you're thinking, is it worth spending all this time on Gen Z, you think about not just their current ability to hold money, but the fact that even if they don't hold it, they might own the decision making around it, and their decision making process is different. And on top of that, they're going to come into that money and eventually, then you want to be anticipating that. And it doesn't mean that you change your entire innovation strategy from one day to the next. It doesn't mean that you supplant your entire hypothesis around your core competency. I'm much more of a fan of the thesis approach, which is you can be on a boat and change one slat at a time and sort of start making these like preparatory features and start validating your market and start understanding how Gen Z views your company, perceives it, decides that it matters or not in their own spending decision making, and figuring out how to then appeal to them. So I'm not advocating for everyone to sort of stop focusing on other generations only to focus on Gen Z, but they have massive impact for the future because it's a very big population size and it's a very big wealth size that is coming. And those two things are going to converge, and it matters very much if you're prepared for that convergence to take place. So, even if they don't own the money yet, they still have decision making. And you see that also in family offices. Lots of new generations within family offices are trying to drive a lot of change in how investment takes place. Actually, Deutsche Bank is a great example of that, because they have, obviously, they hold a lot of the family office wealth in Europe in particular. And one of the things that they discovered was they needed an entire department to figure out impact investing, because that's what new generations wanted to invest in. So even when they don't own the money, they decide a lot of things, because as the silver generation gets older, this decision making power changes, even if the wealth hasn't fully transferred yet.
Great. Well, we just passed the hour, and I'd like to thank you so much for your time and the audience's time. And it's been another Blockchain Factory webinar. Thank you again, Lucia. And I hope that we see you again, ideally
sure.
mentoring one of the projects of the blockchain course. And we're really happy to have you. And thank you again for your time. Thanks. Thank you.
Happily. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.